Purna, do your intro so that we can hear you here. Purna, we're live.
Okay.
Purna, do your intro so that we can hear you.
There's like a lag.
Oh my god. I'll fix it.
There's a lag.
No, it's playing here, that's why. Yeah.
ನಾವ್ ಶುರು ಮಾಡೋಣ. ಇನ್ನ ಒಂದ್ 2-3 ಜನ ಆಚೆ ಇದಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರು ಬರ್ಲಿ ಒಳಗೆ. ಬಟ್ ಈ ಚರ್ಚೆನ ನಾವ್ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ 2 ವರ್ಷದಿಂದ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಕೋತಾ ಇದ್ವಿ. ಪ್ರತಿ ರಾಜ್ಯೋತ್ಸವಕ್ಕೆ ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದ್ ಚರ್ಚೆ ಆರ್ಗನೈಸ್ ಮಾಡೋಣ ಅಂತ ವಿ ಕೆಪ್ ಥಿಂಕಿಂಗ್. ಒಂದು ಸಮ ಸಮಾಜ, ನವ ಸಮಾಜ, ನಮ್ಮ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕನ ನಮ್ಮ ಇತಿಹಾಸದಿಂದ ನಾವ್ ಹೆಂಗೆ ಕಟ್ಕೋಬಹುದು ಅನ್ನೋದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವಿ. ಸೊ ಈ ರಾಜ್ಯೋತ್ಸವ ಸ್ವಾತಿ ಅವರು ನಮ್ ಜೊತೆ ಈ ಟಾಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಡಕ್ಕೆ ಒಪ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರು, ಎಲ್ಲ ಕೂಡಿ ಬಂತು. ಸೊ ವಿ ವೆರಿ ಹ್ಯಾಪಿ ದಟ್ ಸ್ವಾತಿ is here with us today for this talk. So with no further delay, I want to hand it over to Swati because we are already running behind schedule. I don't want to talk too much. So Swati.
Okay. Thank you all for coming here today, and thank you to ALF and to Purna for this invitation. Um, I will start by telling you all a little bit about what I do for my living, and it is that I teach history to a very small group of history students. So, part of this work is coming from the PhD that I did a while back, but the reflections that I'd like to share here today are coming from my engagement with history, my engagement with history students, today's talk is called History as Hope, Revisiting Possibilities for Karnataka. And this is an opportune time for us to think about history because, Karnataka Rajyotsava is on the anvil, it's tomorrow. So it's a good time to revisit some of the key moments from the past, but also certain possibilities that the past held, which were forgotten, which were lost, or which didn't make it to the present in a way. Just 1 minute, Aishwarya. Can you move this panel? Wasn't able to move this panel.
You may want to sit here because
All right, thank you so much. So, I often begin my classes on history by asking students why history and what is the purpose of history, or why should we learn history. And I get fairly standard answers, which is to say that history will help us learn from our mistakes from the past and hopefully not make them again. History explains the present to us, and history helps us make better decisions. These are often things that we say when we ask why history. And what if we think in today's talk, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what if we don't think of history as a teaching resource. Say, for instance, to say, here's what you can learn from history. What if we don't think of history as predictive in nature or as a warning? If this is what will happen if you act like this. So what if we don't think like that? What if we don't think of history as a way of shaming ourselves and into acting correctly? So we've had much of Europe, for instance, being ashamed of the Holocaust, etc., and allowing for more injustices to take place. So what if history is not a way to shame ourselves into acting correctly? definitely not to think of history as a way to correct past wrongs, right? Historical wrongs. So what if history is none of that, but what if we can think of history as offering us new resources to reimagine how we act in the present and how we reimagine our futures? And so it's a proposition. History as hope is a proposition that I'm making. And what does this proposition mean? It means to think about the past as as having had multiple possibilities, and perhaps one of these possibilities gained momentum, gained political and social traction, and so eventually panned out. So, but what of all of those other possibilities that were being proposed in the past, and revisiting these possibilities and the convictions with which these possibilities were argued for, could these possibly be ways in which we can use to reshape our present? Not in a literal way of let's destroy what exists right now and bring back the past and whatever possibilities that existed, but what if we paid attention to the hopes, the anxieties, the fears, convictions with which people from the past made their proposals? And so, given that the talk is around the state of Karnataka, the linguistic state of Karnataka, I will talk a little bit about, I will draw, I will ground my proposition in this case of Karnataka. So, in popular narratives, in public discourse, Karnataka is often understood as Karnataka was formed in 1956 and was a way to correct historical wrongs. People were split, dismembered rather, over different provinces, and so this is a dismembered nation that came together, and it was the culmination of a people's desire to be united under their own state, and so so we need to hold on to Karnataka and its and defend it in a way, because it was the culmination of a long held desire. That is often how it is presented in literature, presented in public discourse, presented in political discourse, etc. So then, what use does remembering and revisiting a time before the formation of Karnataka possibly hold for us? And um, that's what I would like to invite you on in thinking about along with me. So, some basic historical facts. Karnataka was created through bringing together Kannada-speaking areas of Bombay and Madras Presidency, Hyderabad, Deccan, Coorg, some smaller principalities, as well as the whole of Mysore state. When the State's Reorganization Commission proposed or recommended the creation of Karnataka, they cited homogeneity, or a linguistic homogeneity, as the rationale for creating this new state. But my question then is was homogeneity always a concern for people who were asking for Karnataka? And would it what would it mean to then pay attention to what were some of the other arguments that people were making about why a Karnataka was necessary, was needed? And most of us know that many of the first articulation for a separate Karnataka province came from Bombay Presidency, or what we now know as Bijapur, Dharwad, mostly Dharwad and northwestern parts of Karnataka. So, but if you look at documents from that time, there were multiple organizations that had been formed. So there was the Karnataka Unification Sangha, the Mangalore-based All Karnataka Unification Committee. So multiple people's associations had been formed, and actually their argument was far more pragmatic. So they asked for a Karnataka province to be formed based on financial viability. And so they said that Karnataka, So their arguments were around territorial. Kannada-speaking areas were located in the edges of the Bombay Presidency, and so they were neglected. The administrative benefits of having a new separate Karnataka province was something that they argued, and so they said they pointed to Mysore and said, "Look what happens when we are all brought together under one separate administrative province, and we can make advances as much as Mysore has done." Um, they also argued that the region is incredibly rich geologically. So we have minerals, and if minerals could be exploited properly under focused administration, so much of the potential of the region could be released. And it was not being released because of the lack of concentrated administration. So so the argument was less around linguistic affinities, but rather was pivoting around the shared experience of neglect and underdevelopment in Karnataka region in Bombay Presidency. And so to pay attention to that shared experience rather than to of neglect rather than of linguistic affinities is what I'm proposing when we look at these arguments that people were making in the 1930s and the 40s. So we need to then pay attention not only to linguistic affinities, but also to articulations of domination. Right? So when people were asking for a separate Karnataka province, they were not asking because they were all, not only because they spoke the same language, but also because they resented being dominated, and they felt that their potential was being held back because of that. So the first articulations for the need for a separate province called Karnataka was rooted then in the aspiration for self-rule, for equality and freedom from domination. And again, these individuals who were speaking, who were proposing a Karnataka province of also pointed to Mysore to say what can happen under a state that was their own. So they said that pointing to Mysore, they talked about the industrial activity that had been possible, and so they said, and I'm quoting from one publication, the government of India would do well immediately to form Karnataka into a separate province so that it may develop industrially under the fostering care of a government. So it was a state that they looked for, which would foster them, which would care for them, and would hence build up, and through that build up the province and its potential. So the linguistic state was then a vehicle through which domination would be challenged, right? So what I'm trying to argue then is not that we should undermine the characterization of this as a linguistic movement, but rather to pay attention to other kinds of articulations that were happening at this point, which is then to say that does contemporary Karnataka and the state and administration of Karnataka continue to embody this hope? Does it still hold out hope for being a state that challenges domination? Right. So that is the that's the question that I want us to hold on to while when we think about this. So what some of these things that I'm saying are available in public domain, but I'm trying to reframe them for us to think about how these can act as potential resources for us to reimagine, a just Karnataka, I suppose. The second narrative about Karnataka is around Karnataka's formation, is around how there was some opposition to Karnataka from Mysore state, and the focus is on what arguments are made in favor of this creation of Karnataka. So often it is said that people who opposed the formation of linguistic states were most concerned about how this would affect national integrity and how these sub-nationalities that would grow because of linguistic states could then possibly destroy the Indian nation. We also need to remember that this is happening at a time uh, when partition has taken place a few years ago, and India is still reeling under the effects of partition. Evacuee rehabilitation is still a major concern. States, particularly North Indian states, are struggling. We've had Hyderabad, which was the Hyderabad state, which was integrated or taken over by the Indian Union. So there are multiple anxieties that are dominating the ruling elite at this point in India. So so uh, so obviously, it is it is but natural, I suppose, or it is but inevitable that this would be an argument that is made um, that encouraging sub nationalism is going to threaten India's territorial integrity. But I'm not dealing with that aspect, but I just want to say that I want to move away from this kind of framing of linguistic nationalism to actually think about what can we draw from all the oppositions that came to the linguistic state, not in terms of the Indian nation, and what were some of the cautions that were being offered by some political leaders in this point in time against the idea of a linguistic state. So I'm not arguing, I'm not proposing, I'm not revisiting these arguments about a linguistic state or anti-linguistic state arguments in order to repeat the same point of a nation, but rather to say what are some of the things that we need to pay attention to what they were saying. And one such argument is the idea of Karnataka as a composite state. What is a composite state? A composite state is one that is not homogeneous, and that one that is composed of various elements. So um, and uh, um, and so for this section, I'm going to draw a little bit from the debates that were taking place in the Mysore Legislative Assembly about this. And on screen is an excerpt from a speech made by Sidney Thomas, who was a member of the Mysore Legislative Assembly, and he's bemoaning the fact that already this linguistic chauvinism in some sense is destroying the composite fabric of Mysore society or Mysore state, and to the extent that we don't have schools of from Tamil and Telugu schools coming up in Mysore state anymore. And we also have another member of the assembly called Veeranna Gowda, who's talking about why must we think of the Kannada speaking state as being only something that only Kannada speakers have a relationship with. What of the fact that that we have Tamil speakers, Telugu speakers, and for them this land is just as much as it is of Kannada speakers. So these are a couple of excerpts from the assembly debates, and I bring this to you here because I want to draw your attention to how they're presenting the lived reality of the Mysore state at that point in time. And some of these individuals were against the creation of a Kannada speaking state, but what I want to draw our attention to is how they spoke about difference, or how they spoke about what their anxieties were about what it means to live with difference in a linguistic state. So we have here Kengal Hanumantaya, who was a supporter of Karnataka state or Mysore state, and in fact. He occupied both positions of arguing for Mysore as a composite state, but also for Karnataka. So while the other two individuals were against the formation of a Kannada speaking state, Kengal Hanumantaya was the chief minister at that point in time, and he is arguing for the composite legacy of Mysore state to continue in a linguistic state. And so he says, we have made no distinction between Telugu speaking man, the Kannada speaking man. We have lived like brothers and worked for the prosperity of the state. And in fact, he was an individual who was horrified about when uh, uh, when there were public rallies around the idea of Kannada Mata, Mother Karnataka, etc. And so, for him, this that was an instance of linguistic chauvinism, which was not acceptable in the upcoming state. And so here we have the idea of Mysore or of Karnataka as a composite state, and so for us, then the question is, how can we? What does it mean to pay attention to these articulations of an opposition, of a caution, of what a state what a state should be like? What is the up to arrive state? What should it look like? And so these are some questions that come to me in terms of when we think about these historical articulations or articulations from leaders of the past. How does how is it that we are thinking about heterogeneity? How can we use these instances or use these articulations of heterogeneity to reshape our both our public and political life in the present? One of the um, one of the tragic outcomes of the creation of, say, India, Pakistan, or of multiple linguistic states has been the creation of minorities. So communities moved from being people and communities to becoming minorities. And that aspect of minoritization has informed the lives of many of these communities. So if we have to think of a state, of a Karnataka state, as something that in which we learn to live with difference, learn to negotiate with difference, and where people are not minorities or communities are not minorities, can we think of living with difference as a political possibility? And that's really what Kengal Hanumantaya was also trying to ask us to be cautious about. And and this is something, the last point here that I'm saying is something that is uh, we often hear in progressive political movements about a past in which Karnataka was tolerant, about a historical past in which Karnataka was tolerant, was and had a history of coexistence, etc. Um, but as a historian, I take a bit of issue with that, to say that these are all mythical constructions. The past is full of conflicts, and Karnataka, the ancient past, is no different. So instead of resorting to mythical pasts, where supposedly we all coexisted, can we really hold on to this idea of living with difference, and to continuously center that living with difference and hold that to be the vision of Bahutva Karnataka, right? Bahutva Karnataka is an ideal, as a hope, as a possibility, and as something that we have to constantly strive to bring to existence, rather than to say that it existed in the past and so now we want to bring it back into the future, into the present. So that, I think, is what these debates around Karnataka and its formation bring to us. But um, I also want to move a little beyond Karnataka. So, in my own work, I have looked at, I begin actually by looking at the state of Hyderabad Deccan, which was ruled by the Asaf Jahis for over 2 centuries. And the Hyderabad Deccan state was integrated into the Indian Union in 1948 under police action. And then later in 1956, the state was disintegrated, split apart into different linguistic provinces. So parts joined what is now Maharashtra, parts joined Karnataka. So what we know as the Gulbarga, Bidar, Raichur, all of them were part of Hyderabad state at some point. And then, of course, Telangana and Andhra together formed the Andhra state, Andhra Pradesh. So, but what does it mean when we are thinking about it in terms of Karnataka, right? So, for very long, or often the dominant discourse around Karnataka is that there were demands for a state, people fought, and then finally the state was realized. So, it's this very neat story in which we can talk about people's sacrifices, um, we can celebrate the coming to fruition of a nation that had long been held. But again, as a historian, I think this narrative needs some correction, and we need to understand that. At this point in time, between the 1930s and 50s, there were many other proposals for territorial reorganization. So what eventually panned out is that, all linguistic communities should form one state. That, yes, that is the present we're living in, but there were other contending visions, and I want to take you through some of those other contending visions. So, in the Mysore Legislative Assembly, during the debate around the state's reorganization commission report, we find mention of something called a Dakshina Pradesh. Dakshina Pradesh. So this is coming at a time when many who had opposed the formation of or the inclusion of Mysore with other provinces, the Mysore was now going to be a reality. So many had accepted that, including someone like Devraj Aras, who had opposed the formation of Karnataka. This is a point in time in 1956, early 1956, when everyone's come around to the idea that Mysore is going to happen, an expanded Mysore or a new Mysore state is going to come into being. So revisiting again that, so now we see the same individuals who had opposed Mysore proposing something called a Dakshina Pradesh. And there are multiple possibilities for this Dakshina Pradesh. It could be one multilingual territory which contained all the South Indian states, and there was a zonal council that was overseeing it. It could be that a few multilingual states would come together. So it could be Madras and Kerala, Andhra and Mysore, or Kerala and Mysore, etc. So multiple possibilities were being debated at this point in time. And there were many reasons people offered as well. So one, of course, was offered by someone called Hetsi Linga Reddy, who said, hey, look, there was something called a Vijayanagara state, which was a bilingual state, and it was, it had Telugu and Kannada speakers. So now maybe we could recreate a similar state like that, because that could help us overcome these increasing instances of linguistic isolation that is taking place. So that was one reason that was offered, and the second reason was that this Dakshina Pradesh is better for the nation. It would stem linguistic fanaticism, and it would preserve and promote national integration. And this was a reason that Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance, and Rajagopalachari, for instance, proposed were extremely in favor of this idea of a Dakshina Pradesh. Nehru is of course operating from a time from a space where he's having to deal with the continuing after effects of partition. So even though the Congress had initially been in the 1920s and 30s been in favor of linguistic provinces, the partition is alters their political ideology in very significant ways. So Nehru is one such individual who's not who's proposing the Dakshina Pradesh. So there are others who say that Dakshina Pradesh is actually better for the South. So the States Reorganization Commission is essentially what it did, and is to carve out linguistic states in the South, but many other Hindi-speaking states, for instance, continue to have larger territories. And in an electoral democracy, of course, larger territories means more representation and hence more power. And we see that working out now in Uttar Pradesh. Incidentally, this is the phrase balkanization of the South is something that Ambedkar also uses, and to criticize the States Reorganization Commission report. And so they say, so there are people in the Karnataka, I mean, in the Mysore State Assembly as well, who are saying that this could actually prevent a sense of inferiority that the South might feel because of the lack of numbers that it has, and so it could counter the dominance. This Dakshina Pradesh could counter the dominance of North Indian states of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh. This is something for us to think about, revisit this now, given the possibilities of delimitation, etc., and the political contestations around it. So instead of thinking of asking women to have more babies, perhaps one could think of other kinds of political possibilities as well. So in fact, so the final reason for this Dakshina Pradesh is actually more geographical and developmental. So they do argue for people like Devraj Aras and a few others are arguing for Dakshina Pradesh because the South Indian states share multiple rivers, and this is the time for state-led development. So they are saying that it would be so much more easier to have large infrastructural projects without having to negotiate state loyalties here. So particularly river water projects are some things that people are talking about as problems that can be stemmed if we have this Dakshina Pradesh. So that is one possibility, one territorial vision that existed in the 1950s, in which Karnataka as a linguistic state was not so important as much as thinking about political power, representation, development, and such like. The other territorial vision that existed that people were arguing for was to retain Hyderabad. We acknowledge to some extent in Karnataka that yes, Karnataka was formed out of various different Kannada-speaking areas, but what we don't acknowledge is that these regions had their own histories. And so what is the implication of this difference is often not recognized. So earlier on, in my presentation, I spoke about Karnataka province being an articulation against domination, right? So even now, if we pay close attention to what individuals and political parties or social organizations from North Karnataka are saying, is that we don't have enough political representation, we don't have enough political power in in governing Karnataka. And so we've not paid attention to what that difference is of bringing together different regions. We've only talked about it in terms of, oh, this region is underdeveloped, or it's a burden, and so we need to do something. So we've had a paternal attitude from a South Karnataka dominated political leadership and bureaucracy. We've had a paternalistic attitude towards regions of North and Northeast Karnataka. Um, so um, so that's one point that I wanted to sort of reiterate. But um, we also don't pay. We are in Karnataka, in scholarship on Karnataka, particularly emerging from Karnataka, we don't do connections. We don't place Karnataka in the context of what was happening just in its neighborhood, in India, or globally. Right, so we've scholarship on Karnataka unfortunately has remained to it's been rigorous, yes, but it's remained insular to influences and borrowings from uh, other historical contexts. So, so what one needs to pay attention to then is that the formation of Karnataka and other linguistic states in South India was connected also to the disintegration of Hyderabad, right? This large state that existed, and so I want to dwell a little bit on what were some of the arguments for retaining Hyderabad that people were making. It was very similar in some sense to the arguments for retaining a Mysore state as is. And so we've had people ranging again from Jawaharlal Nehru to one of the most important Arya Samajist leaders from Hyderabad. All of them united around the idea that Hyderabad must be retained because one, because it's a composite state, and the other argument that was being made. So Hyderabad was considered to be a babel of tongues. In Hyderabad state, people spoke Telugu, Tamil, Urdu, Kannada, um, and several other languages, and so it was considered to be an artificial state. And so that was one of the reasons put forward, or arguments put forward, to disintegrate the state of Hyderabad. And so in fact, so responding to these arguments, one Arya Samajist leader, who's Pandit Narendra, who had actually fought against the Nizam, led movements against the Nizam, he says that he dismisses the argument of Hyderabad as an unnatural unit, because he says if that were the case, then India itself would be deemed unnatural because about 52 languages are spoken. So what is this insistence on linguistic homogeneity, right? So he and so then there are others who are talking about Hyderabad as an essentially bilingual state. So in different regions of Hyderabad, um, so for instance, often we don't see these two. I put these two maps here together because we don't see the connections between the two. Right? That's on your right. On our right, we have Hyderabad state, which was divided largely along these three lines. So Marathwada went to what is now Maharashtra, Karnataka went to Karnataka, and Telangana went to Andhra Pradesh. But the disintegration of that state is what allowed for this state to come in the way that it is. So, and that's the connection that I sort of want to make. Uh, so, um, so then this period of the 1940s and 50s, when people are arguing for multilingual states, is yet another reiteration of how difference should be the political principle within which we live and constitute our public and political life, right? Homogeneity would only go on to create minorities, would only go on to create political communities that are marginalized, are considered to be suspect. And so this is the argument that I want to make, that that one is not asking for for the existing states to be dismantled, but rather to see what was it that was operating when people were making these arguments, or passionately making these arguments, in fact, um, for a different organizing principle. My last thing is around Shyam Sundar. Um, Shyam Sundar is not very well known in parts of South Karnataka, although Karnataka has had a very vigorous Dalit movement. His reputation has been restricted to Hyderabad, Karnataka region. So, Shyam Sundar, just to give a brief outline about his life, he was a very important leader in Hyderabad during the Nizam's time, and he had a close association with the Nizam, and he used his proximity to build welfare hostels and schools for people, for the depressed classes in Hyderabad. He was a strong supporter of retaining Hyderabad as a state. But when it disintegrated, he joined electoral politics and was in fact successfully contested from Bhalki in Bidar, and won elections there. He also started the Bhim Sena, which is often invoked by Dalit groups in Hyderabad, Karnataka. And although he had his differences with Ambedkar, he spoke similarly to Ambedkar, and the term that he uses, that he tried to propagate through the Bhim Sena, was Mool Bhartis. So that's a brief introduction to Shyam Sundar, but I want to focus here on his proposals for new territorial reorganizations. So he argued that, in fact, the ways in which the constituencies of that had been delimited in India meant that caste Hindus had a deciding vote in every constituency. So electoral democracy was not going to live up to its promise if this kind of this kind of constituencies existed, and so he called for the creation of 6 new states. Unfortunately, no one's created a map of his proposal, so I'm just going to have to read it. The first was Paschimi Pradesh, and the Paschimi Pradesh for him consisted of Meerut and Rohilkhand divisions, and the districts of Aligarh, Rampur. And here he said Muslims, scheduled castes, and Christians would be dominant, and so they would be in electoral majority. He then proposed Purbi Pradesh, which comprised areas such as Bhagalpur and the Santhal Parganas, and where the Muslims and scheduled castes would be a sizable number. He then proposed Malabar as a state that would be created for Muslims. He proposed Kakshani Pradesh, which is a long stretch that extended from Goa to the southern tip of India, and this is where Christians, scheduled castes, and Muslims lived and formed a sizable majority. He proposed Telangana for the sizable number of Muslims and scheduled castes that lived there. And finally, he proposed Mool Bharti Pradesh, which consisted of Ranchi, Chota Nagpur, Chhattisgarh, Bastar, where scheduled castes and tribes formed a substantial majority. For him, for Shyam Sundar, in these new states, these minorities would be numerically in the majority, and this would allow for a fair representations of minorities in electoral politics. So it is this vision that he proposed, which of course was not taken up, but later on in 1969, he also proposed the idea of a Deccan Pradesh, and in which he said this would be a state in which both English and Hindi would be mediums of instructions. And he said, he proposed this because he said that the grievances of the peoples of this region were similar, and that Deccan Pradesh was consisted of Telangana, Marathwada, and Hyderabad. And he also said that this could be a state that linked the north and the south. And so much like Ambedkar, he was also against linguistic states because he said, and I quote, "In Karnataka, Lingayats are thinking of establishing the Lingayat Raj. The Reddis in Andhra are for a Reddy Raj. The Marathas for Maratha Raj. Nobody seems to say Jai Hind, but they say Jai Andhra, Jai Karnataka, Jai Maratha." And this has become the slogan for communal governments in the south, and that scheduled castes are being used by these rulers to fuel their communal furnace. So, um, so I think Shyam Sundar's territorial visions are something that may not be a political possibility at the moment. But what I want to draw on from these three different territorial visions, one of Hyderabad, one of Dakshina Pradesh, and the other of this Deccan Pradesh, etc., Shamsundar's territorial visions. None of these proposals, of course, came to fruition, but they were argued for, they were forcefully argued for, and they were passionately argued for. And so, what is it that we can draw from for the present from these proposals? And my argument is that they represented some anxieties about a linguistic chauvinism that would demand compliance from minorities, from people, and that this would create minorities out of communities. So we need to pay attention to the anxieties that informed these visions. We need to pay attention to the hope that people were proposing when they talked about composite states, that we would have to negotiate our presence and futures according to more material realities. Do we have rivers that we share? Do we have large development projects that we share? And finally, with Shyam Sundar, the demand that egalitarian principles of territorial reorganization must be put in place, and that it must center the historically disprivileged in the sense of, and when he talked about scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, Muslims, and Christians. So finally, I want to end with the idea of history as hope. The proposal, as I said, is not to resurrect these territorial visions and make them a reality, but because they were made under specific historical circumstances and under very different, vastly different political and economic conditions. But what we need to pay attention to is what the aspirations and desires of these that inform these proposals, that these proposals embodied, and if they are necessary for our present. So not a wholesale uncritical borrowing from the past, but to reimagine and rework them for us. And I think in that lies the hope that history offers. Thank you.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸ್ವಾತಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ. ಈಗ ಇನ್ನ 7 ಗಂಟೆ ಆಗಿದೆ, ಸೊ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕೇಳ್ಬೋದು. It's only 7:05, so you all have questions on what she's presented or anything connected, please feel free to ask.
So, like in this timeline itself, what was the prevailing like thought process or discourse among the communist parties? Because they were also quite strong in Hyderabad.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just want to know like what they.
The communists were in favor of the disintegration of Hyderabad, and they believed that Hyderabad state was the feudal autocratic state, and so many communist parties were part of the movement against Nizam, of course, and they even opposed the. So Nizam goes on to become the Raj Pramukh, or the governor of Hyderabad. So they even opposed his, but they were very much in favor of the disintegration of Hyderabad.
So you mentioned that the southern part of Bombay presidency. They wanted to like join, like they were feeling neglected and they were developmentally also a little behind their northern counterparts. So that's why they wanted, like for very pragmatic reasons. But I was just trying to understand the thought process as to how they felt like they could join the Mysore state and
Yeah.
because their Mysore state being very prosperous and that disparity continues till today.
Correct,
So I was just wondering how that
Actually, when they were proposing this in the 1930s, they did not want to join Mysore. That was not the proposal at all.
okay.
They wanted a separate Karnataka province within British India itself. And so they were asking for that. So their vision was not to become part of Mysore, but um, over time, the Mysore state and Karnataka province coming together becomes more and more a political discourse. So that's when, even then, they're not fully on board. They rather actually want to create a separate Karnataka province where they can administer themselves. Again, much of this presentation is not focused on some of the more specific conflicts, like for instance who were leading these linguistic movements, and what is the caste composition of these linguistic movements. So I'm not dealt with those aspects. So because I wanted to make a different point of what we can draw from these possibilities. But yeah, I mean, they were not really they were not dependent on Mysore to join them in order to create a Karnataka.
What is the pushback from generally from the proposal made by Shamsundar of the I think one two
Yeah.
six parts? What was the general pushback?
So by the time Shamsundar is proposing these things, he doesn't have the same political clout that he did in Hyderabad. So he was a major proponent of Azad Hyderabad, which is to retain Hyderabad as an independent state, independent country. And so while he was a fierce and Dalit leader, and V.T. Rajshekhar Shetty, who's a very well-known journalist from those parts, has written about Shamsundar as the father of Dalit movement in Karnataka, and he so. Some of his ardent followers were Mallikarjun Kharge and Basvalingappa, etc., from the Busa um, controversy. But he has not gained as much political importance or salience. So there was no pushback. It was a proposal he made. And at that point in time, he was also trying to bring together um, um, bring together different kinds of Bahujan communities. So this proposal that I spoke about, he's actually making this in a convention in Lucknow where Periyar and many others are there. So in some sense, Shamsundar preceded um, the founder of BSP, Kanshiram. Sorry, yes. So the vision that he had was similar to what Kanshiram had in trying to bring together multiple kinds of minorities, political minorities. So, yeah. So there was no pushback, unfortunately, and also like there's very little documentation of Shamsundar's life or like we don't have access to his documents, so it's hard to say. So this what I picked up are from newspaper reports from that time. So there's not much discussion on what people's reactions were to this. Yeah.
Was like the prevailing discourse in the other parts of this? Like for example, like any other articulations like this, say from like the parts of coast, for example, which was part of Madras, or like Coorg, which was like a very small state. Like, were there any other articulations like this coming from those parts?
Can you just repeat his question because the laptop wouldn't have got
Oh,
it?
okay. So you were asking about what are some other kind of political articulations that were coming up. I would have to say that I don't really know because my focus has been on looking at Hyderabad and Karnataka. So, but I imagine that there must be similar articulations that were coming up because there was the Aikya Kerala movement happening in Kerala, which also led to the formation of Kerala, and we know also about the disparity uh, about Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So, and Telangana and Andhra, and the dissenting articulations from Telangana about joining Andhra. So the States Reorganization Commission actually said that Telangana will exist as a separate state and then later join Andhra. So those kinds of articulations did there. So connected history of the South doesn't exist. Unfortunately, the linguistic states have enabled the creation of insular histories, so much so that we don't actually look at how we're all connected to each other, even within this small peninsular region. So that really is the work that we need to do in order to think about these connections. So we only think about it in terms of border disputes, right? And that, and these border languages which don't form. So there are anomalies. They exist only as anomalies, but not as deep connections that bind us all together.
I may add a little bit on that. Well, this is not to say that I am aware of other types of articulations, but at least linguistically, when the debates were going on, Kodagu or Coorg was actually against integrating with Karnataka, firstly, because the Kodavas see themselves as a separate ethnic group, and also they have a different history in terms of they've always seen the Haleri dynasty, for example, as somebody who came from outside and ruled over them rather than seeing it as self-rule. So, and even during the British time, it was under a direct commissionerate and not either integrated with Mysore state, which it had a very, its
Conflicting
own,
relation.
conflictual relationship, especially during Tipu Sultan. There was that, and this Tudu movement, which was very nascent at that point in time. We hear it now much more, but uh, they were trying to, when it comes to the question of Kasargod, Udupi, and current Mangalore districts, the three districts, they were pushing for a separate Tulunad state, which would not integrate with either rest of Karnataka or Kerala.
Yeah.
But there was a claim by Kerala over Tulunad, and ultimately the elites in Tulunad decided to integrate with Karnataka. But it was not as much as they as it, a decision that they actually imposed, but it was ultimately Karnataka was formed even not as a result of the Ekikarna movement, but because of all the other kinds of calculations that the State Reorganizations Act, the committee was actually
Yeah.
looking into. So what they did was all the majority Kannada speaking areas plus minority areas. They just dumped it together and called it Karnataka.
Yeah.
And one additional thing was that, as far as I know, I mean, this is a very nuanced thing, that the Harvard's idea was we will create a Karnataka based on Kannada. For Mysore, it is your choice whether you want to be part of it or not.
Yes. Yeah.
If you do not agree, we will still
Yeah.
go ahead and create
Yeah.
it. Also.
Yeah.
So Mysore had to eventually budge and
Mysore too, there was stiff opposition to the idea of joining, of having these areas being included in Mysore state. So the imagination was never to think about a new Mysore state, but rather an expanded Mysore state, which then means that you have the old Mysore state as the nucleus, and then you have all these other states joining in. Right, so you're always in addition. The other regions then became just in addition and not an So Karnataka is an unprecedented historical formation. There is no precedence for Karnataka in history. So we might have events like from Krishna to Kaveri and things like that that's happening, but those are all mythical invocations. It is, and if we don't recognize that in 1956, and we have not recognized it, in 1956, we formed a state called Mysore or Karnataka, and it has never before existed in history. Then we will never pay attention to what is the work that needed to go to create this Karnataka, right? So if you brought in different regions with different histories, then you needed to actively do the work of creating that, holding the Karnataka state's promise of inclusive development. And so that never happened because we then went back into thinking about how Karnataka existed during the Vijayanagara time, during some other time, etc. So we just kept going back into history, and that's how all nations write about themselves. So in history, we call this nationalist historiography. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't have connected histories of the South. Because even soon after the state of Karnataka is formed, there are gazetteers being written. There are historic books about Karnataka's history that are being commissioned by the state government at that point in time. And they all go back to an ancient past and invoke these ancient past in which Krishna, Godavari to Kaveri, etc. All of these invocations are supposed historical invocations are made. But the work of the present gets lost when we try to go back to a mythical past. So that is so my revisiting the past is slightly different to actually say that okay, none of them came to fruition, none of these proposals came to fruition, but they were being articulated because there were some very real anxieties and fears and hopes that they were saying. So what can we then draw from that uh, for our present?
Sorry if I may just like I'm just a little confused with what you said. You said that the northern Karnataka districts had decided they form a state, and it was up to Mysore whether what created that power dynamic is what like if they are calling
I
the
think part of it was covered in a presentation where see, Mysore has its own history. It was not under Bombay presidency.
right.
So it it saw itself as an independent state where
So it has existed as a princely state for a very long
very
time.
long time and also
It was also considered to be a model state. So Mysore prided itself on the fact that it was supposedly highly developed, even though there were pockets of massive underdevelopment. But that was the narrative that Mysore had. So, in fact, in a earlier presentation that I'd made at ALF itself, there's something that they talk about called the Mysore standard. So they go about doing survey in all these other parts of Karnataka to see if they meet the standard of what Mysore has. And the result of all of this is to say that look, Mysore has to now take on the burden of in having all these underdeveloped territories. So some people say yes, we should do it. Like there are infirm brothers. Let's make them better. Sorry. I said that they talk about Mysore prides itself on its legacy of rich development, and at the time that a proposal for Mysore state is formed, we have the Sheshadri committee that's formed, and they go about doing a fact finding in all these areas, and they come up with a standard called the Mysore standard. So they go to all these different regions and survey them for their education, health, roads, etc., to see what is the level of development, and they measure everything against what a Mysore standard is. So that entire thing creates a discourse of how Mysore has to look after its poor
oh like that.
men,
So it is
and so yeah, yes. paternalistic, saying that let's look after our underdeveloped brothers. Some argue against Karnataka or against Mysore for the very reason, for the same reason. Some others are saying, no, let's, like, they are our mentally ill brothers, and so let us.
Also, like I think one other explanation, I don't, because I think we have also are, I'm slightly hesitant to bring it up because I think Swati's intention is also to go beyond like chauvinistic tendencies of people. But one explanation for this power dynamic was also the fact that in a combined state of, like, say, the northwestern Karnataka and the Mysore state, like Lingayats would like get a majority, right? Like in the Mysore state, Vocaligas would have the majority, and in the northwestern part, Lingayats would have majority.
Okay.
But because Lingayats also form a substantial minority in Mysore, plus the majority, like the dominance in Karnataka, in the combined state, Lingayats would get a slight advantage over Vocaligas, which actually we saw happening once the state got created. So that was also one factor, but obviously, like,
Yeah, I mean, that is a fairly common thing that people say about to what extent it is, like, politically accurate, I'm not sure.
It's academically established. Like, if you look at that, it's clear in the right.
Yeah.
No, I mean, this is there in academic historiography. The caste angle is there, the development
No,
angle
it
is there.
It's there, but again, I'm not entirely. So what happens again is that we get caught up with these things to not actually see the other things that existed. So it becomes about men, caste, and politics. So everything else, all other frameworks are lost, and that is one unfortunate thing about the ways in which Karnataka has been written about by people in Karnataka. That there's a standard history. You go and ask any male academic here, they will tell you that history about how the Lingayats moved away from Congress because of some betrayal and things like that. That is a standard, unquestioned history that everybody will say. But it does not actually talk about people, people's movements, and other kinds of articulations that are coming up. So, unfortunately, that hold has to be sort of broken.
I had a small question. My only point is all the presentation I really liked, and I also could select on some level. My point was, why not actually think of it? Why only leave it as a strand of hope? Why not think of it resurrected? Or why one sort of a hesitancy to think?
Yeah, the hesitation comes from the fact, I suppose, from being, from identifying myself as a historian. One thing that we learn in history is to not extrapolate or generalize, and to say that everything is historically contingent. So when people are making these proposals of different sort of territorial visions, they are making under specific circumstances. So which is why I kept mentioning that partition was an overriding material reality that the Indian state was reckoning with. And so those are all, there are specific historical circumstances under which these proposals were being made. So this is not to say that they are not valid anymore, not to say that they must not be resurrected at all. But that would again make us go in the direction of, I don't know, like iconoclasm in a way, to say that this person, Sham Sundar, said this, and he was this amazing, great Dalit leader. So now we will try to bring that back. But our reality is very different. The Indian state has gone through waves of neoliberal development, etc., and the scheduled caste Muslims and tribal communities that he's talking about are no longer in the same situation. So I'm not saying that one must not try to see if it still holds political possibility, but I'm just saying that we must be cautious about wholesale adoption from the past, because if we continue to do that, we are doing what dominant historians have dominant historiography does, which is to say that there was a Vijayanagara Empire, so let's try to bring that back here to present day Karnataka. So I'm just saying that we should be more agential in how we think about our present.
No, I don't know much history of the other regions that time, but
None of us really know it.
I was wondering if there is anything like that was happening parallelly in other regions, like I was just thinking either northeast or like
Fair question, but I don't really actually know too much about that. Yeah, we should, but I don't.
yeah, because I think I really like this idea of how the connected history of
Yeah,
regions.
yeah.
I also want to understand how much of a top down is it from Shastri and that influence, because it's coming from Andhra, Hyderabad,
Right.
like that
Yeah.
influence over here in Karnataka,
Yeah.
in Karnataka,
Yeah.
stories of political, like I'm not used to
Right.
it.
Yeah. So actually, that's an interesting question. There's this historian called Lisa Mitchell who has written about language and emotion and the formation of princely states. So she begins by this one incident of multiple instances actually of people setting themselves on fire in order to demand for a separate state. So we know this very important instance of Potti Sriramalu who in Andhra. But she also says this 1950s is a time when in Bangladesh too, or what was East Pakistan then, that there too there were language movements where people were sacrificing themselves in the call for a different nation. So the argument that she's trying to make is that look, we will all say that this, for instance, the caste argument, right? That these are elites who are negotiating, etc., etc. But how do we really how do we take account of the fact that there were emotions involved in the creation of a linguistic state? The people, to the extent that people were willing to sacrifice their own lives, right? Which makes me pause and not, which is why I'm not wholesale dismissing the linguistic state, but I'm saying, and because that has a lot of traction even now in the present, right? So it does bring people together, it does create some sense of belonging, etc. But so there is emotion, and there is political emotion there. So we don't dismiss it in order to replace it with something rational, but we also then need to think of, not dismiss it as only a top-down approach. But of course, historically, if you see the States Reorganization Commission, for instance, kept saying linguistic homogeneity, but in many cases, it didn't follow that at all. Right? In the case of, say, in some cases, it said, no, let's retain this composite state. But in the case of Hyderabad, it said, let's destroy it. So these things were there. So it was not a. I mean, it's a more messy scene than we acknowledge it to be.
One states reorganization committee never clearly said we support linguistic states. It was always multiple logic, economic viability, ease of administration. Ambedkar would say that these states should not become again fiefdoms of upper caste. So especially concerning metropolitan cities. So there were all these other questions that were considered. It's not a simple okay. These are the languages, so let's draw the borders.
I didn't get a chance to talk about Ambedkar, but he also made different sets of proposals about how you should. He talked about one language, one state versus one state was one language. So he said he called for the breakup of, say, what is now Uttar Pradesh, and said that you can have multiple Hindi-speaking states. So you don't need to have one state and one language. You can have one language and one state. So as a way to break up political dominance. He was not talking about small states, but I mean, that was one argument. But he was trying to say that in an electoral democracy, this kind of political dominance doesn't work, should not work.
ಬಾಂಬೆನ ಮಾತ್ರ ಒಂದು ಕೇಂದ್ರಾಡಳಿತ ಪ್ರದೇಶ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ
ಅದು ಇತ್ತು, ಹೌದು.
ಆಮೇಲೆ ಪ್ರತ್ಯೇಕ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಇತರ ಭಾಷಾವಾರ ಪ್ರಾಂತ್ಯಗಳು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅದೊಂದು ಭಯ. ಅದು ದೇಶ ವಿಭಜನೆ ಆದಾಗ ಜನ ಮತ್ತೆ ಅದು ಕೂಡ ಸ್ಮಾಲ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ಸ್ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ.
ಹಾ.
ಎಷ್ಟು ಸ್ಮಾಲ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ಸ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅದು ಒಳ್ಳೇದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಆಡಳಿತ.
ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ದೇವರಾಜ್ ಅರಸ್ ಅವರೆಲ್ಲಾನು ಕೂಡ ಮೈಸೂರು ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಹಾಗೆ ಇರಬೇಕು, ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಸ್ಮಾಲ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ಸ್ ಇದ್ರೆ ಅವಾಗ ನಾವು ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಅವರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು.
Movements happening around that period, because as you answered, like the Telangana struggle was the reason why the Hyderabad, like what was similarly happening here?
Unfortunately, so when I've looked at Hyderabad, Karnataka, unfortunately we don't have too many in that particular region. At least the only other political movement that has been documented is the one against Nizam. So but the set of actors are very interesting. So you had the Hindu Mahasabha, the Arya Samaj, the Hyderabad State Congress, all of them working together along the border areas of Hyderabad and attacking Hyderabadi state's state infrastructure, etc., to create a sense of disorder and chaos, and that's been documented. So that's the sort of people's movement that we sort of hear about. But within Hyderabad, there was the very strong Azad Hyderabad movement, which again was not. It was not. It was it also had a heterogeneous composition. So you had Dalits and Muslims, and so Shamsundar was one votary of a Dalit Muslim unity back then as well. Shamsundar is really a figure that we must like recover for Karnataka and for South's history.
So one question I have is more of like maybe you can. So even after all of this, like you said, they were not able to fully make that homogenization possible, even in the case of Karnataka, right? Like if you compare it to other southern states, it's a lot more composite nature in Karnataka compared to others. And also like
no, every state is composite only.
Yeah, but more composite in terms of
no, there's no more composite. I disagree with the more compositeness.
But like okay, and that composite nature is also ever evolving, right? Like with continuous movements of people across. So like going forward, at least like because you also say history as well. What are the possibilities that you can think of? Because even in Bangalore, if we see there's like so much like there's no quantification of heterogeneity, but you see heterogeneity in Bangalore to a lot of extent. But like it's very difficult for us to like make any argument for say Telugus of Bangalore or Tamils of Bangalore or the Dakini speakers of Bangalore. But there are all of those people in Bangalore. So how do we make these composite like possibilities happen culturally, like politically, like what?
So I mean, I think that's really where our political action should lie. But again, I just want to say that like the reason that I was talking about all these like about heterogeneity and difference is because the creation of the linguistic state did not eliminate these differences. What it did was to make people and communities into minorities. And then for them to have to constantly prove that they are authentically Kannada or authentically Tamil, etc. So, and that was what they were. So that's what they were warning against. That what a linguistic state could do to people, could do to lived reality. It has reshaped lived reality in order to create an experience of minoritization for communities. So Urdu speakers, for instance, Dakini speakers, for instance, are not considered to be properly Kannada people. Right, so Kannada people has essentially become those who speak Kannada, and that to a particular kind of Kannada, which is South Kannada, right? South Karnataka's Kannada. So, we've had, I think someone had written, I forget his name, this famous journalist who just wrote a book on Devegowda. Sugata Srinivas Raju. So he starts by talking about how Siddaramaiah in the assembly shames someone from North Karnataka, an MLA from North Karnataka, by saying you don't know how to speak Kannada properly. So it creates a certain ideal Kannada speaker who should not be speaking English. If I'm talking about Karnataka, I should not be speaking in English. I should be speaking in Kannada. But has a long history here, right? And so that becomes something to think about in terms of how do we like hold difference and how do we make space for difference. And uh, one way to think about it is like, say, what are people in different parts of Karnataka saying, who are not from this political center that's Bangalore and this old Mysore region, right? So we have they have been talking about their about persistent lack of share in the state's development, and this whole focus, this overdevelopment of Bangalore to the neglect of all these different parts of the state. That's one example of how we've not really been able to hold uh, difference and heterogeneity and equality, right? Like, so this, they still talk about domination from South Karnataka over North Karnataka. So why is it that after 69 years of a linguistic state, that is still the articulation that's coming? And and that like actually betrays what the hope of a Karnataka province was back then.
ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಮೈಸೂರು ರಾಜ್ಯದಿಂದ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕಕ್ಕೆ ಕೂಡ ಉದ್ದೇಶಕ್ಕೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಜನ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮೈಸೂರಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟೀಸ್ ಬಂದಾಗ
Yeah.
ನೀವು ಆ ಕಡೆ
ಬಟ್ ಹೆಸರು ಚೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, ಬಟ್ ಆಟಿಟ್ಯೂಡ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಯ್ತಾ ಅಂತ.
ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಹೆಸರು ಚೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡೋ ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಎಲ್ಲ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು, ಬಟ್ ಅಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ.
ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದ್ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಈ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿತ್ತು. ಆ ಟೈಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನೀವ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ ಮೇಲ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಒಂದ್ ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡರ್ಡ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ. ಈಗ ನಾವು ನೋಡಿದ ಕನ್ಸೆಪ್ಚುಲೈಸೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕೂಡ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಗಂಡಸ್ರಿದೆ. ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಯಾವ ತರ ಬೇಕು, ಏನ್ ಕಟ್ಬೇಕು, ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಕಟ್ಬೇಕು, ಇತ್ತ ನೋಡಿದ್ರ ಆಯ್ತಾ ಅಂತ.
ಯಾ
ಸಾಧ್ಯನೇ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಸಾಧ್ಯತೆಗಳಿರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ.
ಶಶಾಂಕ್, ನೀವ್ ಹೇಳಿ, ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾ ಯಾರಾದ್ರೂ?
ನಾನು ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಅದು ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಮಾಡಿರೋರೆ ಬಹಳ ಕಮ್ಮಿ.
ಸೊ ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ವರ್ಕ್ ಇನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿರುವಂತ ಕೆಲಸ ಅದು. ವಿಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಮೂವ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅಥವಾ ವಿಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ಗನೈಸೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಅಥವಾ ವಿಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಕಲೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ವಿಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಏನಿತ್ತು ಅನ್ನೋದು ನಾವು ಇದುವರೆಗೂ ಎಲ್ಲೂ ನೋಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಶಿಪ್ ತುಂಬಾ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ. ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಸೋಶಿಯಾಲಜಿ, ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ನೋಡಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಸೋಷಿಯಲ್ ಸೈನ್ಸಸ್ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಶಿಪ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬಾ ಕಡಿಮೆ. ಇನ್ನ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡೋದಿದೆ. ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬಾ ಕೆಲಸ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಬಟ್ so I suppose like if you have to gain some degree of fame in Karnataka, you have to engage with literature. Social sciences has unfortunately remained neglected. So very few historians with a feminist vision. ಬಟ್ ಅವ್ರು ಬರೀ ಮೈಸೂರ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಪ್ರಾಂತಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ.
ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮೋರ್ ಆನ್ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲಿಸ್ಟ್ ಮೂವ್ಮೆಂಟ್, ಕನ್ನಡ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಏಕೀಕರಣ ಸರೌಂಡಿಂಗ್.
ಇಲ್ಲ, ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಏಕೀಕರಣದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಅವ್ರು ಮಾಡಿರೋದು ಮೈಸೂರು ರಾಜ್ಯದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಸೊ ಅವ್ರು ಪ್ರಿನ್ಸ್ಲಿ ಮೈಸೂರ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ಪ್ರಿನ್ಸ್ಲಿ ಮೈಸೂರ್ದು ರಿಲೇಶನ್ಶಿಪ್, ಮತ್ತೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಮೂವ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ವಿಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ದೇವದಾಸಿ ಮೂವ್ಮೆಂಟ್, ಆ ದೇವದಾಸಿ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಅದನ್ನ ನೋಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅವರು. ಬಟ್ ಈ ಏಕೀಕರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರು ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಅನ್ನೋದು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ.
Just adding on to that googly question, in which part of the world, like you're a historian, so I'm asking you, have women surrounded around an organizing principle like language, caste, nation? ಈ ತರ ನಾವು ಹೋಗಿ ಒಂದ್ ನೇಷನ್ ಕಟ್ಟೋಣ ಅಂತ ಯಾವತ್ತಾದ್ರೂ ವಿಮೆನ್ ಎದ್ದಿದಾರ?
I mean, 1970s in the women's movement ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಒಂದ್ ರೀತಿ there's a vision for the nation. 1970s ಇಂದ ಏನ್ women's movement ಶುರು ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅದನ್ನ ನೋಡ್ಬೋದು. That is a different vision of for the Indian nation ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬಹುದು. ಬಟ್ ಅದಕ್ ಮುಂಚೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ I mean, ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. But similarly, at the same time, 1960s ಅಲ್ಲಿ Pakistan women's movement ಕೂಡ ಶುರು ಆಗುತ್ತೆ as an opposition to some of the hudud laws. So, yeah, but ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ.
ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಆರ್ ಕಲ್ಯಾಣಮ್ಮ ಅವರೆಲ್ಲ ಇದ್ರು.
Okay.
ಮತ್ತೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಕಮಿಷನರ್ ಕೂಡ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಕೂಟ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಐಡಿಯಾ ಇತ್ತು, ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ರು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು, ಆದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಚಾನ್ಸಸ್ ಇರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳಿಗೆ ಅದ್ರ ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡೋ ಅವಕಾಶ
I think, but
ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ ಆಗದೆ
In Hanoi, when I visited, they have constructed a museum called Women's History Museum, and that museum is divided into some 5 sections, like cultural, political, even their armed resistance. Like they have divided into all of these sections, and it is dedicated to documenting the struggles and the participation of women in all those different.
Yeah, that reminds me, Telangana movement ali, the role of women, particularly, and then the role of Dalit women, that has all been documented. But again, that is because
they imagined a nation state.
So that not a nation state. So
state at least one political territory ಬೇಕು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಾವು ಈ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಿನ್ಸಿಪಲ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಈ ತರ ಜನ ಮಾತ್ರ ಇರ್ಬೇಕು ಆತರ.
I mean, most women struggles that we have heard of is against very real material realities of. That's what you wanted me to say.
Correct answer. You passed her exam.
Right.
Okay.
But if I may, I mean, this.
Sorry, last question, after which we'll open up for an informal chat. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm just like, based on this conversation, I'm just thinking because in would Andhra Telangana, coming from that region, like one classic case of Chaklaylamma in Andhra, is there influence of like the entire Naxal communist belt, that influence with the Nizam issues and all also pushed, and then like are there any of such kind of speakers or someone who spoke from the extreme left who came out from the Karnataka or any of these regions that also stood like, because that's the only booming movement
So
that I'm
if
thinking
we
of.
go back in to the 1940s, etc., the revolutionary left movement is in the Telangana countryside. And it does not come to Hyderabad, Karnataka or Marathwada. Very little presence is there. What is present there is this so-called freedom movement against the Nizam. So that is the more dominant political movement and not the left movement here. So again, none of these have become part of the history of Karnataka. This is history of Karnataka, right? That so you will see the Gulbarga Gazetteer, Aduidwella Gazetteers, so full of mistakes. It is riddled with mistakes. It is such poor quality. The publications are of such poor quality, and it is very biased. You cannot rely on that for any understanding of that region. So that is again another indicator of the kind of neglect. If the state is not investing in writing the histories of that region, even if it is a nationalist history, if they're not investing, then you can imagine the extent to which they don't exist in the imagination of a Karnataka. I mean, it's all easy for us to say sitting here in South Karnataka, but I suppose one thing to think about is like, what do we do? How can we think of Karnataka by centering the margins, right? These are political margins that were created with the creation of Karnataka. So can we think about a Karnataka in which these regions are in the center and see what it must mean to imagine a just Karnataka?
On that note, once again, ನಿಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ALF ಪರವಾಗಿ ಸ್ವಾತಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಚರ್ಚೆನಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬಾ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ವಿಷಯಗಳು ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ಇನ್ನ ಮುಂದಿನ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಇನ್ನಷ್ಟು ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಚರ್ಚೆ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಅದು ಮುಗಿಬಾರ್ದು. ಮತ್ತೆ ನಿಮ್ನ ಕರಿತೀವಿ. ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ವೇದಿಕೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ನಿಮ್ ಜೊತೆ ಬೇರೆ ಚಿಂತಕರನ್ನು ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಸೊ ದಟ್ ವಿ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಕೀಪ್ ದಿಸ್ ಕಾನ್ವರ್ಸೇಷನ್ ಗೋಯಿಂಗ್. ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲೂ ಮಾತಾಡಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅಟ್ಲೀಸ್ಟ್ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಎಲ್ಲಾದ್ರ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಸೊ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸೋ ಮಚ್. ಇವತ್ತು ತುಂಬಾ ಟ್ರಾಫಿಕ್ ಇದೆ, ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲೂ ನೀವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಬಂದ್ರಿ ನಮ್ ಜೊತೆ ಕೊನೆ ತನಕ ಎಷ್ಟು ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂದ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು. Just two announcements. We have a